Chapter 8. The first thing Eobach perceived was a certain staleness to the air in the chamber. The process of suspended animation is a combination of cryonics, electromagnetic fields, and chemical cocktails put into the air surrounding the body. There is no perception of time passing, so it actually felt like he had just closed the hatch to his pod a minute ago. He opened his eyes and blinked a couple times to try and focus on what he was seeing. He remembered the glass above his head had been crystal clear when he entered the chamber. Now it was cloudy, as if covered with a thick, dusty film, and it seemed like there was an object just beyond. Instinctively, he wiggled his fingers, and his brain received the necessary signals indicating they were still attached. Reaching down to the lever that would open the chamber door, he pulled on it to no avail. There was no cause for concern, yet. When he applied more strength to the lever, it gave way and unlocked the door. When he went to open the door, though, it wouldn't move. That's when his brain registered that the object he noticed earlier, just beyond the cloudy glass, was, in fact, blocking his egress. The suspended animation pods are built in such a way that when a person enters one, they end up leaning against a pad which sits at a 45-degree angle. The door to the pod runs its entire height. Overall, it stands about 3 meters tall. To the side of where the door to the pod swings open and closes, there's a status panel where various readouts can be seen. The indicator lights are dominated by a large panel which shines green if everything is okay, or another color if attention needs to be given to the pod or its occupant. Eobach started pushing against the door. It took quite a bit of effort to get it open a little bit so he could reach his hand out through the crack to get a grip on the shelving unit resting against his pod. Finally, after considerable effort, he successfully slid the bookshelf off the door to his pod. It swung wide, allowing him to exit. The first thing to greet him was a scene of disarray in his apartment. Since it seemed as though no time had passed for him, the difference between what his mind registered as his apartment 10 minutes ago versus now was dramatic. Not only were shelving units toppled over, but some items previously on the tables were not only on the floor, but occupied positions clear across the room. Eobach sensed some sort of catastrophe had happened, and as soon as that thought hit his mind, he was concerned with the status of his family. Instantly, he looked to the 3 full-size pods for his wife, Jilantor, and Nathan, and a smaller one for the baby. The status indicators for each one were all green, so he was able to breathe a sigh of relief. Still a little light-headed from the pod, he steadied himself on a structural support near the window. Just then, as his head started to clear, he looked out the window and saw something which took his breath away. Below the ship was Eden, big, bold, and beautiful. It hung in the blackness of space like a blue and tan miracle. As he stared at the planet below, he marveled how impossible it would be to capture the essence of its beauty. As he appreciated the incredible globe before him now, it occurred to Eobach that Eden had a lot more continental land masses than he expected. In fact, he estimated this planet was actually covered with about 25% land. The rest was open ocean. Standing back from the window, he decided he needed to get some answers on why things were so upside down in his apartment, and he knew just who should be able to answer the questions on his mind. Glendara, status report. No answer. Glendara, status report. Still no answer. Now this was indeed troubling. Why wasn't his amulet companion answering? He certainly had the ability to hear Eobach from anywhere on the ship. Why was he so silent? Eobach decided he needed answers before anything more was done, and since he knew his family was safe and sound in their pods, he opened the main door to his apartment and struck out for the bridge. It had been 4 hours since the command had been given to bring all occupants out of their suspended animation. The revival process of the crew was gradual, since the power and other resources necessary to revive someone from stasis would be too much for the ship if all were to come back at once. It actually took about 3 hours for everyone to be revived. As with Eobach's quarters, most of the crew found their quarters in disarray. When Ruavu awakened, she checked on the status of all her children, who were gratified to see her smiling face. The baby was glad to see its mother and, without knowing any time had gone by, expected to be fed and was quickly rewarded with a meal from Ruavu. Meanwhile, Gilantor and Nathan spent time near the window looking at the incredible beauty of the planet they were orbiting. Ruavu joined them as well, and for the first time saw Eden in all its splendor. She was just as perplexed as Eobach about the disarray in their apartment. She was about to organize her children into cleaning and sprucing when an announcement came over the communications panel near the front door.
Attention all crew members of the starship Erigena. This is Captain Eobach Aramin.
"Mom," shouted Jill. "Dad's making an announcement." Ruavu came close to the comm panel so she could hear the voice of her husband.
As you can see by taking a glance out the windows, continued Eobach, we are now in orbit. There will be a meeting in Hangar 1 in exactly 1 hour for all crew. Attendance is required. That is all.
"Well," said Ruavu, "that means we have about 45 minutes to get this place in order." She then handed out assignments to her children, who, being good kids, assisted their mother handily. They made quick work of the necessary cleanup tasks, and about 50 minutes later emerged from their quarters to go to the hangar. Upon their arrival, the Aramin family was greeted by the sight of 1,300 or so members of the crew, who were all segregated into various conversation groups. As Ruavu passed the different groups, she heard topics of conversation ranging from the disarray of the crew quarters to the unexpected amounts of land now visible on the planet below. One person mused that being able to find the palominium mineral was probably going to be a lot easier than they originally thought, when they believed the mineral would come from sources deep underwater. After making her way to the front of the hangar, she was able to take a seat. Not only was she given one because of her relation to the captain, but because she had a baby in tow. Looking around, she tried in vain for about 5 minutes to locate her husband. "After all," she mused to herself, "I haven't seen him in 10 years. It didn't feel like that long, of course, but it was a little personal levity which brought a smile to her face. As she continued to look around, she was finally able to locate Eobach off in the distance in a corner of the hangar, conferring with a few other men. One of those was Krelon, but there were 2 other men in that discussion group she didn't recognize. It seemed they were having a serious discussion, so she decided to leave them be and not interrupt. As she was sitting and waiting for the meeting to start, she eavesdropped on a discussion going on behind her. The crew members behind her were talking about the strange condition of their quarters, but also about something else that was unusual. One of them talked about how the quarters near theirs were not strewn about and how everything was in its place. They also said the occupants of those quarters weren't there, so they must have awakened earlier and already straightened things up. About that time, Ruavu noticed the informal meeting her husband was having in the corner had broken up, and Eobach was making his way to the impromptu stage which had been set up. On the stage was a podium, and Eobach made his way there. Meanwhile, Krelon came over to sit with Ruavu and the kids. The characteristic readability of Krelon's face that Ruavu always loved to exploit was showing a lot of emotion, and all Ruavu could glean from his expression was one of great concern for her and the kids. She wanted to ask him about it, but just then Eobach started to speak.
May I please have your attention? Please find your seats.
The general murmur of conversation quickly quieted down, and all who had them found their seats. There were far more personnel than seats, so the walls were lined with people standing at attention, waiting for their captain to begin speaking.
Thank you for coming to order. We have a lot of information to discuss, and it is important to please hold any questions you may have until the end of the briefing. About 4 hours ago, I was revived by our onboard computer system. Standard protocol dictated that when the ship reached the planet, the first to be revived would be me, the captain. Then I would supervise the revival of all personnel. As you can see, the ship is now in standard orbit around the planet.
Ruavu noticed there were several smiling faces looking at each other when Eobach mentioned the planet below.
Shortly, we will begin preparations for landing on one of the planet's oceans. We have selected an area that is southeast of one of the larger continents. We will have access to all that the land masses and oceans have to offer. Our scans indicate this planet has a massive number of life forms, and there is one particular bipedal land-based life form which appears to be dominant on this planet.
Eobach grabbed both sides of the podium and steeled himself for what he knew would be difficult news for his crew to hear.
That is the good news. But unfortunately, not all of what I have to tell you today is good news. The planet we see below us now, the marvelous blue, white, and tan jewel we see out our windows, is not Eden.
There was a hushed recognition on the part of all in the room. Facial expressions changed from anticipation and excitement to ones of confused wonderment. Everyone was hanging on the next words out of Eobach's mouth.
For more on the events leading us to this planet, I would like to call on our acting captain. Glendara, would you come and join me on the stage?
Immediately, a holographic projection of a man dressed similarly to Eobach appeared on the stage, and an omnipotent voice could be heard all around.
Certainly, Eobach. I am glad to be of service. Glendara, would you please tell us about the voyage and the course of events as you remember them?
Asked Eobach.
When we left Galimar,
Glendara began,
the ship was working perfectly. Small items of repair needed to be done along the way, nothing that wasn't easily handled by the robots, except for one occasion when I revived Rezex Deshawn to address an issue with the shield generators, which were operating within acceptable parameters, but the monitoring equipment was malfunctioning. Rezex corrected the problem, then returned to stasis. So,
Eobach inquired,
you're saying all went perfectly normal for the entire trip? Correct. That is, until 2 weeks before we were to establish orbit around Eden. At that time, we received a communication from Gasia headquarters on Galimar. By that time, communications took 4 months and 5 days to get to us, so the urgent nature of the communication from Galimar required I address what it said immediately. And what did that message say?
Asked Eobach.
It told me that deep space astronomers on Galimar detected something wrong with the Eden star system, and they strongly suggested I switch on my long-range scanners.
Ruavu knew all these questions and answers Eobach was asking and Glendara was answering could easily have been presented by Eobach himself. She also knew he was a master at knowing what an audience needed. It was obvious he was establishing confidence in Glendara's actions.
But wouldn't these long-range scanners already be active?
Asked Eobach.
No. According to standard mission protocol, they would not be fired up for another 2 weeks. It was very fortuitous, though, that the communication came when it did. Why was that? When I switched on the scanners, it was immediately obvious why the astronomers on Galimar were so concerned. It was quite evident the sun Eden orbited was in its last throes of life, immediately preceding explosion into a supernova. In fact, the sun had already expanded into a red giant, and its surface now extended past the natural orbit of Eden. By the time I made these observations, Eden had already been destroyed.
An audible gasp could now be heard throughout the room, none the least of which was coming from Ruavu herself. Immediately there was a murmur coming from many gathered in the hangar.
Please come to order. I know this is startling information to hear, and trust me, there is more to come. But we need to maintain order. Let us not forget, we are alive now, and the events we are describing are all in our very distant past.
The room seemed to calm down with those words, and Eobach was able to continue on.
Glendara, please tell us what else was happening. One of the other things that caught my immediate attention was the automatic flight controls had been compensating for the unexpected conditions in this solar system. With the larger star, the gravitational pull had changed, so not only was the ship being bombarded with excess solar radiation, but we were being pulled toward the sun, which was due to explode at any moment. What did you do?
Asked Eobach.
There was only one thing to do, and there wasn't any time to wake you up before I had to act to save the ship and all souls on it. I switched on all 6 shield generators and set them to full power. I then fired the maneuvering thrusters to put us on a collision course with the sun and set our thrust on maximum, which was 108%.
And why did you take this action?
I did this in the hope of achieving escape velocity by performing a slingshot around the backside of the sun, then getting away from its explosion. I wanted to get the ship to as safe a place as possible.
Was this successful?
Yes and no. Yes, because we were able to successfully achieve escape velocity from the sun, and were on our way to safely leave the solar system and get to a point where I could revive you and come up with a plan of action. Once we had begun moving away from the sun, I angled the ship around so the 6 shield generators were all directed toward the sun, in case something bad happened.
And why would you say no? Asked Eobach.
I would say no because something bad did happen. As soon as we began moving away from the red giant, the sun exploded. I have no information after that point,
answered Glendara. Once again, another gasp made its way across all present in the room. The tale being told was otherworldly. It was incredible that all these events happened to each and every inhabitant of this room, yet it seemed they all had a form of collective amnesia, since none present had any knowledge of them. Eobach waited for the room to calm down, then spoke again.
This is where I need to continue the story. When I was revived 4 hours ago, I was greeted with living quarters in disarray, as most of you also discovered when you were revived from suspended animation.
Ruavu thought about how Eobach was referring to the same quarters she and the children had just straightened up. For a moment she wondered why Eobach hadn't revived them when he had awakened. Then, she reasoned, he had much to discover when he was revived. Since he knew she and the kids were okay, they could be revived later. It made sense to her.
In fact,
Eobach continued,
when I came to, I discovered a shelving unit had toppled over onto the door to my pod, and it took a lot of work to extricate myself. After getting my bearings, I went to the bridge to see why Glendara wasn't answering my inquiries. I was concerned for my friend. What I discovered on the bridge was a room in as much disarray as my quarters. I also discovered the amulet where Glendara lives was no longer secured in its cradle, but was now lying on the floor near the captain's chair. I not only picked up the amulet to see if Glendara was all right, but I then took the necessary steps to revive these two gentlemen.
At this point, the two men he was referring to stood up next to him.
I'd like to introduce you to two key members of the bridge personnel. To my left is Rizax Deshan, the Eregina's chief engineer and officer of sciences, and to my right is Chikorov Lenin, chief stellar cartographer. After several conversations with these men, and after reviewing the logs kept by Glendara and by the ship itself, a picture started to form of what happened once Glendara lost connection with the ship. Evidently, the explosion of the Eden Sun caused a shock wave more massive than anything we've ever encountered. The shock wave hit the ship, and had it not been for Glendara angling the shields toward the exploding sun, we would most certainly have been destroyed instantly.
Taking a measured breath, he added with notable emotion in his voice,
I am deeply saddened to report we didn't escape without injury. When we were speeding away from the sun, and the shockwave hit our ship, several quarters in the anterior portion of the ship were completely destroyed, and
Eobach paused.
It is my unpleasant duty to inform you the Eregina has suffered the loss of 34 members of the crew who lived in those quarters.
Ruavu heard the crew member sitting behind her, who had been talking about those quarters, start to quietly weep. Sniffles could be heard throughout the hangar.
Some of you may have noticed those quarters were not in disarray. After the disaster, automatic systems on the ship triggered builder robots to rebuild the damaged parts of the ship. Although there was quite a bit of damage to the ship, fortunately, the vast majority of us survived the assault, and the builder robots were able to restore the ship to its former state. That shockwave did quite a lot of damage, though, and it is why your quarters were in such disarray when you awakened. It is why the amulet where Glendara lives was violently and unexpectedly ejected from its cradle, causing him to no longer be in control of the ship.
Many in the room looked down at the floor as they struggled to take in all the information presented to them. Some looked to the significant ones in their lives, as if to make sure that they were still there, as if to see if they were still safe. Even Eobach looked down to the front of the audience and made eye contact with his own soulmate.
I know this is a lot to take in. Trust me, I've been wrestling with all this myself for the past couple of hours. While it is true that all here are safe and sound, this doesn't change the obvious fact we are orbiting around a planet which, while not Eden, is still an amazing planet. The question remaining is, where are we? To answer that, I have invited Chikorov Lenin, our chief stellar cartographer, to speak to us. Chikorov, please tell us about your discoveries.
Certainly, Eobach. My first goal was to establish where we were in the cosmos. Classically, this meant taking stock of the constellations evident in the skies and matching them to known charts we have in our databases. This is what I did.
And what did you discover?
That's just it. I didn't discover anything about our present position, since none of the constellations I was used to seeing were evident in the skies. There was simply no way to get my bearings.
What did you do at that point?
Asked Eobach. Keep in mind that what I'm about to describe to you is comprised of materials that came to my attention only 2 hours ago. To piece together available evidence on where we are, I went to the main computer and scanned the memory banks for information on our voyage.
What did you find? Asked Eobach.
When I went to check the voyage logs, I expected them to be only a certain size. They were larger by a factor of 6,000%. This meant the recordings had been going far longer than we anticipated. Eobach turned to the group of crew members who were hanging on Chikorov's words.
I must warn you, he paused. The next pieces of information will be extremely difficult to hear, but I ask that you maintain professional conduct.
To reinforce the words, Eobach stared at the audience for a few seconds before resuming his talk with Chikorov.
Were you able to go through those recordings?
Not all of them, but I scanned through the highlights and pieced together what happened immediately after the shockwave hit the ship. Apparently, aside from causing great damage, the shockwave caused our ship to accelerate to 0.917 of the speed of light. We were now hurtling through space at speeds no Galimarian had ever achieved before.
How long did we travel at this speed?
Turning to the crew in the room, Chikorov answered the question directly. The crew expected to be asleep in the suspended animation chambers for only 10 years. In reality, we have been asleep for 600 years. As expected, this piece of news was astounding to the crew, and many leapt to their feet at hearing this news. There was a general outbreak of shock and dismay. The amount of time that had gone by wasn't horrible. Some in the room were well over 15,000 years old themselves, so 600 years away from their home wasn't all that bad. After allowing the news to sink in, Eobach continued questioning Chikorov.
How did we arrive at this planet?
The navigation programs I wrote to guide this ship were programmed to search for a Class M planet and, upon finding it, to slow down the ship and establish orbit. Those same programs had a failsafe built into them so that when orbit was established, the suspended animation pod for the captain would be activated and he would be revived. Since the original planet we were in search of was no more, and since Glandara was no longer in control of the ship, those programs continued to follow their programming. When it found the planet underneath us, the ship was slowed to a stop, and orbit was established. Keep in mind, we were traveling at an extremely accelerated speed for the entire time of this voyage. There was no reason to slow the speed of the ship, since the scanners Glandara had left on just before he lost control of the ship reported no Class M planets along the ship's course.
I'm going to ask a very hard question now, said Eobach. Is returning to Galimar an option?
Chikorov's gaze faltered. He looked down at the floor, then simply answered, No.
Why is that?
Answered Eobach. Up to this point, Chikorov had been facing Eobach and was addressing him directly. Now Chikorov turned to face the members of the crew. The reason why we can't go back is because of the laws of physics. We may have been traveling for only 600 years from our perspective, but because we were traveling so fast, time for us has been proceeding very slowly. While it was only 600 years for us, for those we left behind on Galimar, approximately 1,150,000 years have gone by. Everything and everyone we knew on Galimar, most likely, are no longer there. Those standing in front of their chairs no longer had the ability to stand, and those leaning against the walls slid down till they were sitting on the floor. They were all astute enough to see this was the result of a series of unforeseen events which could never have been forecasted. The demise of the Eden planet, the explosion of its sun, and the accelerated trip were things beyond the ability to predict. But now there was a new reality. Not only were they somewhere far, far away from their home, but that home was probably nothing like what they knew. There certainly would no longer be anybody they knew living. It truly felt like they were the last of their species. Most dipped their heads, contemplating the crushing reality that their lives had been irreversibly altered, and there was no going back. All they had lost, and all they ever knew, was gone forever. Sounds of weeping from those gathered could be heard. Eobach felt bad for those present, including his own family, who were taking this news just as hard as the rest of the crew. He wanted to put as good a spin on their situation as possible, so he followed up with a question to the chief engineer.
Rezax, can you tell me about the planet below?
I can tell you that we have never encountered a planet that is as much like Galimar as this one. The sheer variety and amount of life in the seas is staggering to the imagination. It is more than one could ever hope to discover in a lifetime. The variety of life walking on land is equally as numerous and varied. There are seasons just like what we have on Galimar. There are deserts, forests, and green lands where crops could be cultivated. There are trees on this planet that reach thousands of meters in the air, and the skies appear blue to those walking on the ground. 70% of the planet is covered in water, mostly salty. There are massive freshwater lakes, and the number of natural phenomena present on this planet is far too numerous to mention. It will most certainly take more than several generations of our people to explore all that is here. We have taken a shuttle to various places on this planet, and we have even met with the major indigenous life form present on the land. We have learned they are far too barbaric for us to mingle with, so we should avoid them until they socially evolve to a place where our interface with them would be mutually advantageous. We have taken to calling this planet Eden, since the original planet called Eden is no more.
Do they have a name for their planet? What do they call themselves?
Asked Eobach. Rezax turned back to Eobach and said, They call themselves humans, and they call the planet Earth.